The jungle took her before anyone noticed she was gone. That was the part no one put in the report. Not the part about the ambush, not the part about the bridge, not even the part about what Sergeant Harwick said to her 3 hours before the mission went sideways. Just a line about a soldier who failed to return to the extraction point. One line, passive tense. Like she'd simply wandered off. Her name was Tessa Vane, Staff Sergeant, 3rd Special Forces Group, attached temporarily to a joint reconnaissance element, operating out of a forward operating base the size of a hockey rink carved into the edge of the Darien. She was 31 years old. She'd qualified expert on every weapons platform the Army had put in front of her since she was 22. She'd spent 2 deployments reading terrain the way other people read faces, fluently, instinctively, always a half-second ahead of the landscape's intentions. None of that was in the report either. What Harwick had said to her that morning, standing by the equipment cage while the others were drawing weapons, was that she should ride the second vehicle back and manage comms. He hadn't said it unkindly. That almost made it worse. He'd said it the way you tell someone to hold the door, casually, without thinking, without wondering whether the person holding the door might have been the one who should have walked through it first. Vane had looked at him. She'd counted to 3 the way her father used to tell her to count before saying anything she couldn't take back. She said, "I'm on the primary element, sir." Harwick had nodded in a way that didn't mean yes. "I know what the manifest says." He'd turned and walked away, and the conversation was over, in the way that conversations with men like Harwick were always over. Not because anything had been resolved, but because he'd simply stopped participating. She'd stood there for a moment, with her hand on the cage door, looking at the rifles racked in their slots. Then she picked up her kit and joined the primary element, and didn't say anything else about it. That had been 0630. By 1340, she was alone in 40,000 hectares of jungle, with a dislocated shoulder, a missing radio, and an intelligence file she'd memorized because she'd learned a long time ago not to trust paper in a wet environment. The ambush had come from the north side of the logging road, which was wrong. Every intelligence summary they'd been handed said the active corridor ran east-west along the river drainage. She'd flagged it twice during the planning brief. Harwick had thanked her for the input. The ambush came from the north. She didn't have time to feel anything particular about that. When the first vehicle went sideways into the ditch and the second one stalled on a root mass the size of a dining room table, she was already out the door and into the undergrowth on the south side, which was the correct side because that's where the ground broke downhill toward the creek, and the creek meant cover and cover meant options. She heard Garza shouting. She heard Devlin return fire. She crawled on her stomach through root litter and red mud for approximately 40 meters, before the sounds of the contact started to separate into distinct tracks she could follow. This was suppressing fire. This was movement. This was someone taking a hit. She did not hear Harwick call her name. She would think about that later. What she had, her rifle, 4 full magazines, a knife, a field dressing, her watch, the clothes she was wearing, and the contents of her left cargo pocket, a folded piece of laminated map she'd cut down herself because the issued maps were too large to carry flat, and a small notebook she'd been keeping since Kandahar, in which she wrote down things she didn't want to forget. What she didn't have, her radio, which had come off her kit when she rolled into the ditch, her water, which was in the vehicle. Any immediate idea of where the rest of her element had gone. She stayed in the creek bottom for 6 minutes, long enough for the contact to shift north and the shooting to thin out into single shots, long enough to think. She'd been told once, by a woman who'd spent 15 years as a search and rescue tech in northern Manitoba before joining the reserves, that survival thinking was not about controlling fear. It was about giving fear a job. You took the thing that was trying to shut your brain down and you put it to work. You said, "Fine, what do I have? What do I need? What's the first step?" Vane had thought about that a lot over the years. She thought about it now, crouched in 6 inches of brown water with mud drying on her forearms and something moving in the canopy above her. What she had, she'd already inventoried. What she needed was to know whether the element had exfilled or was still in the area. What the first step was, that was the question. She climbed the bank slowly and looked back the way she'd come. The second vehicle was still visible through the trees, canted at a 45-degree angle. No movement around it. No voices. Either they'd exfilled fast, Harwick style, or they'd moved to a secondary rally point she hadn't been briefed on, which was also Harwick style. She checked her watch. If they'd called for exfil immediately after the contact, the earliest a bird could reach them was another 40 minutes out, which meant if she moved now, she might still catch them at the primary PZ. She moved. The shoulder had happened somewhere in the creek bottom, probably when she rolled. She couldn't raise her right arm above chest height, and the pain when she tried was specific and bright, like a signal fire. She kept the arm close to her body and worked her way through the undergrowth, using her left hand, her knees, the weight of her own judgment about where the ground was solid and where it wasn't. She reached the primary PZ at 1423. There was a square of flattened grass where a helicopter had been and gone. The grass was still pressed down. Couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. She stood in the middle of the clearing. For a moment, this was the part she would have trouble explaining later. Not because she didn't understand it, but because it seemed too simple to be believable. She could have stayed in the clearing. She could have activated her personal locator beacon, the one piece of gear she had that Harwick hadn't factored into his reassignment of her role, and waited for recovery. That was the right move tactically. That was the move that ended the story with everyone going home. She thought about it. Then she thought about the intelligence file, the one that had been the actual reason for the mission. The one that said a man named Carvalho, who was not the man they thought he was, had been moving product through a series of collection points that ended at a structure 12 kilometers northeast of her current position. The one that said there was a third party involved that nobody in the chain of command had been willing to say out loud in a planning brief, because saying it out loud made it a problem that required a decision. She'd read that file 4 times. She'd committed the coordinates to memory because she'd committed everything to memory since Kandahar. Since the day a guy named Trikel had told her that women had a harder time with spatial orientation under stress, and she'd gone back to her bunk that night and started memorizing everything in sight just to have something to do with her hands. 12 kilometers. She clicked the locator beacon once, the activation code that told receiving stations she was alive and mobile, not the distress code, and she started walking northeast. She would think about that decision differently at different points in the next 9 hours. At hour 2, when the shoulder was making every step a small negotiation, she thought it was probably the stupidest thing she'd ever done. At hour 4, when she found the first collection point exactly where the file said it would be, and had the presence of mind to photograph the contents with the small backup camera she'd been carrying in her notebook pocket, since a fire base in Logar province taught her to carry a backup camera, she thought maybe it wasn't. At hour 6, when the canopy thinned and she could see lights, she stopped and looked at the lights for a long time. The structure was not what the intelligence file had described. That happens sometimes. Sources describe things through memory and translation and their own incomplete information. And what arrived at the analyst's desk bore some relationship to reality the way a photocopy of a photocopy bore some relationship to the original. The structure the file described was a logistics depot. What she was looking at was something closer to a command site. There were 3 vehicles she could identify, 2 of which had the kind of antenna arrays that didn't belong on equipment you were moving product with. There were lights in 4 windows. There were 2 men outside the main entrance. She inventoried again. 4 magazines. Dislocated shoulder. No comms. 12 kilometers back to the PZ. Unknown number of personnel inside. She thought about what she was actually trying to do here. She wasn't trying to take the site. She was trying to know what it was. There was a difference, a significant one. She moved around the perimeter slowly, taking 40 minutes to complete a circuit that would have taken her 10 in any other condition. She counted personnel, 6 outside at various points, unknown inside. She identified 2 vehicles that were loaded, not unloaded, which meant something was leaving, not arriving. She found a window on the north face of the building where the blackout curtain hadn't been pulled all the way, and she could see part of a table and what was on it. Maps. Not the kind of maps you used for moving product. The kind of maps you used for planning something. She photographed what she could see through the window. She photographed the antenna arrays. She photographed the vehicle registrations. Then she moved back into the tree line and sat down with her back against the cecropia trunk and spent 20 minutes just breathing. She thought about the mission briefing, about the line in the intelligence summary that said the logistics corridor was secondary to the communication network that was running it, about the way Harwick had moved past that line like it was a footnote, about the way she'd read it 3 times. She thought about what she was looking at. The camera held 340 images. She'd taken 47. She still had the notebook. She started writing. She wrote for an hour. Everything she'd seen from the perimeter, everything she'd seen through the window, the vehicle registrations, the antenna types, as best she could identify them, the number of personnel, their positions, the timing of the guard rotation she'd clocked during her circuit. She wrote it in the compressed, specific notation she'd developed over years of writing things down in small spaces. Not shorthand exactly, more like the private language of someone who'd learned that the difference between what you noticed and what you failed to notice could be very large indeed. When she was done, she read it back once. Then she started the 12 kilometers back to the PZ. The shoulder had gotten worse. She knew it would. She kept her right arm locked against her body and moved with her left side doing most of the work, and she didn't think about the pain so much, as she worked around it the way you work around furniture in a dark room. Aware of it, not surprised by it, not stopping because of it. She reached the primary PZ at 0217. She activated the distress code on the locator beacon and sat down in the middle of the clearing to wait. The helicopter came at 0341. It was a Canadian Forces Griffin, which told her several things about who'd been notified and when. The medic on board was a woman named Schultz, who looked at Vane's shoulder and then at Vane's face and made the professional decision to relocate the shoulder immediately rather than waiting for the field hospital, which Vane would always be grateful for because at least the worst part happened over jungle and not over the flight line. They landed at 0519. Harwick was at the field hospital at 0620. He came in without knocking, which was the kind of thing that told you everything you needed to know about a person, and he stood at the end of her cot and looked at her for a moment. "You missed exfil," he said. She looked at him. The shoulder was in a temporary reduction splint, and she'd been given something for the pain that made the edges of the room softer than usual. But her thinking was clear. Her thinking was always clear. "I did," she said. "We called for you. I didn't have comms." He looked at her with the particular expression she'd seen from men like Harwick her entire career. The expression that was not quite contempt and not quite dismissal and not quite either of those things, that existed in the space between them where accountability went to become someone else's problem. "I filed the mission report," he said. "Primary objective was unachieved." "Yes," she said. "I saw." She let that sit for a moment. "I have something for you," she said. She reached to the side table where Schultz had left her personal items in a clear bag. She took out the camera and the notebook. She held them out. Harwick didn't take them right away. He looked at them the way you look at something when you're not sure yet whether it's an asset or a liability. "What is this?" "The site is a command node, not a logistics depot," she said. "The vehicles are outbound, not inbound. Whatever they're moving, it's already gone. The communication infrastructure suggests coordination, at least 2 levels above the contact we were briefed on." She kept her voice level and informational, the way she delivered range scores and maintenance logs and every other piece of information she'd ever handed to a man who'd already decided what he thought before she opened her mouth. "There are maps in there that I partially photographed. The notebook has everything I could document from perimeter and window observation, vehicle registrations, antenna types, guard rotation timing." She watched his face. "I was 12 kilometers northeast of the PZ," she said. "That's in the notebook too." There was a silence in the room that had a specific quality to it, not the silence of disbelief, the silence of someone recalculating. Harwick took the camera. He took the notebook. He looked at them for a moment in a way that was, for the first time since she'd known him, actually attentive. He left without saying anything. She didn't see him again for 3 days. What happened in those 3 days was not something she was party to directly. She knew some of it from Schultz, who had the particular institutional knowledge of someone who'd been in a small base long enough to understand its social ecosystem completely. She knew some of it from Devlin, who came to see her on day 2, with a look on his face she'd seen before in people who just had something confirmed that they'd suspected for a while and weren't sure how to feel about the confirmation. What had happened? The intelligence she'd brought back had gone up the chain fast. The photographs of the maps, the vehicle registrations, 2 of which matched names on a list that had been sitting untouched in an analyst's queue in Ottawa for 11 months because nobody had been able to place the asset, the antenna documentation, all of it. What had also happened Harwick's mission report had noted an unachieved primary objective and one soldier who had failed to reach the extraction point. That report existed. It was already in the system. What also existed now was everything else. On day 3, a man named Forsyth came to see her. He was not in uniform, and he did not introduce himself by rank, which told her his rank. He sat in the chair Schultz had left beside the cot, and he looked at her with the attentive, calibrated expression of someone whose job required them to assess things quickly and accurately. "Walk me through the window observation," he said. She walked him through it. She'd been through it herself many times in the past 3 days, lying in the cot with her shoulder in the splint and the jungle noise coming through the screened window, going over every frame of what she'd seen, testing her memory against her notes, flagging the places where her certainty dropped and the places where it held firm. She knew what she knew. She knew what she didn't know. She told Forsyth the difference, clearly, without embellishment, the way she'd learned to do with range scores and maintenance logs, and every other piece of information she'd been asked to produce since she was 22 years old. He asked her about the maps specifically, about the orientation, the scale markings, the notations she'd seen in the margins. She told him. He made notes. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The registrations you logged. 2 of them placed an asset we've been looking for close to a year." She didn't say anything. "The antenna arrays," he said. "The configuration you described matches a setup used for encrypted burst transmission. Military grade, not cartel hardware." She'd thought so. She hadn't written that conclusion in the notebook because she'd only written what she'd observed, not what she'd concluded. But she'd thought so. Forsyth looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone making an evaluation he'd already substantially completed. "The mission report on file says primary objective unachieved," he said. "I know," she said. "There may be a conversation about that." "There may be," she said. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. She thought about the clearing, about standing in the middle of the flattened grass and knowing the bird had been and gone, about 12 kilometers of jungle in the dark with one working arm and a camera and a notebook. "I wasn't trying to fix the mission report," she said. "I was trying to complete the objective." Forsyth nodded slowly. "The objective," he said, "was the communication network." "Yes," she said, "not the logistics corridor." "No." He closed his notebook. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite approval. Men like Forsyth were careful about approval the way certain engineers were careful about tolerances, but was in the same neighborhood. "Someone's going to want to talk to you in more detail," he said. "Probably not here." She nodded. "The shoulder," he said. "It'll hold," she said. He stood up. He picked up his own notebook and looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. "The guard rotation timing you logged," he said. "How long did you observe before you recorded it?" "1 full cycle," she said. 40 minutes. I wanted the second pass to confirm before I wrote it down." He considered that. "That's good practice," he said. He left. She lay back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the jungle through the window, which was what it had always been, loud, indifferent, full of things moving in directions you couldn't see. She thought about Harwick's report, about the line, about the passive tense. She thought about what Forsyth had not said, which was that the communication network, the actual objective, the one that had been sitting behind the briefed objective like a second door, had been located, documented, and handed up the chain by a soldier. Harwick had tried to move to the second vehicle that morning. She didn't feel triumphant about it. That wasn't the feeling. The feeling was quieter than that. It was the feeling of having done a thing that needed doing, in the conditions that existed, with what she had. It was the feeling of the 40-minute observation, of writing down only what she knew, of the difference between what she'd said to Forsyth and what she'd kept to herself, which was that she'd known since the planning brief that the logistics corridor was the wrong target, and she'd flagged it, and she'd been thanked for her input. She'd done the work anyway. Outside, someone was running a generator that needed servicing. The sound came through the window in irregular pulses, skipping every 3rd or 4th cycle. Schultz had been trying to get it looked at for a week, Devlin had said. Nobody had prioritized it. Vane filed that information in the back of her mind and let it sit there. She was good at that, filing things that mattered in places where she could find them again. She'd been doing it since she was 22 years old. The shoulder ached through the splint, steady and specific. She breathed around it the way she'd breathed around it through 40,000 hectares of jungle. And she closed her eyes. and she waited for whatever came next with the particular patience of someone who had learned, over a long time, that the work spoke for itself. You just had to be willing to do it in the dark.